All right, we're studying in 1 Corinthians chapter 8, but we're actually going to start tonight from James chapter 2. We talked last week about there in 1 Corinthians chapter 8, where Paul talks about how that knowledge puffs up, but love edifies. And that entire chapter is really this contrast with knowledge and love. But to get a better understanding of that contrast, I actually want us to look to James chapter 2. James chapter 2, we find where James is going to contrast faith and works. And what does he associate, or who does he associate with faith? Well, the demons. Say the demons believe and tremble. Who's associated with works? Abraham, Rahab. So if we're just to look at that, what's going to be our conclusion if we're talking about faith and works? Demons, what's, if demons are associated, that's bad, isn't it? The demons have faith, that's bad. Abraham, Rahab have works, that's good. But of course, we know that's not getting the full picture. Because what James is doing, and this is where Martin Luther missed it entirely, James is not saying faith as opposed to works. What was James saying there in James chapter 2? Exactly. He's talking about faith without works or faith with works. Faith without works is bad. To say you believe in God, but it doesn't change the way you live your life, that's not a real, that's the demon's faith. They believe in God, but they didn't change anything about their actions except to tremble. But with Abraham and Rahab, they believed in God, and because they believed in God, they did things. They changed the way they lived their lives. So let's leave this part up. And look now at 1 Corinthians chapter 8, where Paul talks about knowledge and love. I want us to understand that what Paul is doing is he's not saying knowledge or love. He's not contrasting and saying knowledge puffs up. He's not saying knowledge is bad. What Paul is doing is the same thing James did. What Paul is saying is knowledge without love is bad. Knowledge with love is good. And so that's what we're trying to look at here in 1 Corinthians chapter 8, is to recognize what Paul is telling us about knowledge and love. It is knowledge alone that puffs up. But knowledge with love is what edifies. Does that make sense? Does that help to kind of get an understanding of what Paul is talking about here in this chapter? And I forgot to put my slides up, but, oh, are they? Okay, thanks. Great. All right, we talked a little bit, this is kind of what we ended up with last week, talking about liberty. And it's a term that Paul uses here, but he emphasizes the idea that liberty is something that if it is not used with love, if it's knowledge alone, then what is that liberty going to do? What is it doing? It's destructive. It's destroying others. Where, on the other hand, if we use this knowledge, what our liberty is, what our authority is. Remember, we talked about liberty just simply as the idea of authority. It's the right to exist or the right to do something. If we have this knowledge that tells us what we can do, but we temper that with love, then liberty is a wonderful thing. Christian liberty is, in fact, what we see in Paul, that we see in Christ. And that's what we're going to be emphasizing in our very short class this evening. So let's look here at 1 Corinthians chapter 8, and we got down to verse 7. I mentioned that verses 4 through 6 talks about the idea of what knowledge says to us about this idea of liberty. And knowledge makes the argument that there is no such thing as an idol. God is the only God that is, so it doesn't matter about all those idols. You ignore them, do whatever you want as it relates to them, because it has no meaning. And that's true. But now what Paul is going to say is, in contrast to that, what is a knowledge with love? How are you going to use that liberty? What's fascinating is, how many times do you find the word love in verses 7 through the end of the chapter? I'll give you a hint, it's not there at all. How many times do you find the word knowledge? A bunch. I didn't count the exact number, but it's like 3 or 4 times that it's used there. But yet what Paul is doing here is telling us what knowledge with love will do, as opposed to knowledge without love. So what does knowledge with love tell us? Well, Paul begins again by talking about how that knowledge without love is destructive. He starts by saying, not everyone has this knowledge. What does that mean? He just said earlier in the chapter, we all have knowledge. So what does it mean not all has this knowledge? Ted, you do personal training, right? Do you have clients? Are they all in the same place? No, you have to adapt, don't you? Everyone is. Lisa, you teach. All your students have the same capabilities? Again, you have to adapt. You have to recognize that not everybody's in the same place. That's what Paul is saying here. Not everyone has this knowledge. So if not everyone has this knowledge, then what do I have to do? Recognizing that. If Lisa forced every one of her students to meet the standard of the highest student in the class, what would happen? What would it do to all the other students? It'd destroy them. It'd destroy their confidence. They'd all fail if they all had to meet the standard of the very best student. What if we treated everyone else as having the exact same knowledge as the one who knows the most about God's word? Well, that's what Paul says here. Not all have that knowledge, but he says there, the last part of verse 7, their conscience being weak is defiled. Is it defiled because they don't have knowledge? No. He's saying it's defiled because of what I do, because of my actions in front of them. That's where this comes in. What Paul is telling us here is we need to consider where my brother is in his knowledge, in his faith. And I need to temper my actions to do what is best for him. That's what knowledge with love is telling us. He says in verse 10, if someone sees you who have knowledge dining in an idol's temple, will not his conscience, if he is weak, be strengthened to eat things sacrificed to idols? You see, Paul is saying your example. Who was it? Charles Barkley, I think, was the basketball player, said, I'm not anybody's role model. Every one of us is a role model. Every single one. Now, we may not be role models to millions like he was, but every single one of us is a role model to people who sees our lives. And most importantly, we're role models to everybody else in this room. Yeah, go ahead, Ted. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes. That's a very important point. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It could even be somebody you don't like. Very good point. Let's talk about that idea of extreme. What does Jesus say in the Sermon on the Mount? You have heard it said, you're to love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say unto you, like your enemies. Did he say that? No. He said, love your enemies. And that's exactly the point that Ted is making. That is a decision that you make, not based on what they have done, what you like about them. It's a decision you make that you're going to put their best interest at the top of your list. And that's what we're talking about here. Paul is just taking that same application and saying, love your brethren. Make the choice that as you're dealing with the people that you worship with, your own spiritual family, do what's best for them instead of exercising your right to say, hey, I can do this. Now, does that mean they're binding something on you? Now, we talked about that before. When somebody tried to bind something on Titus, Paul said, I'm not going to give an inch on that. So what is he talking about here? Who's doing the binding? This goes back to Ted's point. Who's making that choice? Who makes that choice to love? I do. I'm the only one who can make that choice. You can't make me love. God can't make me love. I'm the only one who can choose to show my knowledge with love. And that's exactly the point that Paul is making here. So when it came to this question, is it okay to eat meat that has been offered to idols? Yes or no? Paul wouldn't give him a yes or no answer. Paul says, well, let me tell you what you really need to do is what's going to be best for your brother. And you need to decide what is going to be best for your brother. Because if you decide something different, let's look at how he finishes. And I got way behind on my slides. Look at how he finishes. Verse 11, for through your knowledge, this is knowledge without love, your knowledge, he who is weak is ruined. the brother for whose sake Christ died. We talked about some of these contrasts that Paul uses last week. We talked about the contrast, knowledge lifts me, where love lifts my brother. Knowledge puffs up, it's something inflated with air, while knowledge edifies, builds up. Here's another one of those contrasts. Look at what he says. Jesus died to save them, and I killed them by the way I live. Which side of that equation you want to be on? That's what Paul says here. You destroy him by your knowledge. I don't want to be undoing what Jesus has done. Jesus died to give them life. I better not live my life in a way that's going to destroy someone else. So what is Paul's conclusion in verse 13? And maybe the word conclusion is not really the right word here, because we're going to see as we get in next week, he's going to continue the thought. He's going to go in a slightly different direction, but the thought continues all the way into chapter 10. But what does he say at this point? What is his choice that he makes, his decision? Yeah, I'm not going to do anything that would cause my brother to stumble. I'll never eat meat again. Is he not eating meat because someone bound that on him? No. Yeah, I agree. I think that's the context in which he's talking, but even it was just not eating meat at all. Paul is making the point, I have my knowledge, and he already said what the knowledge is. There is no such thing as an idol. That's an invention of man, and it doesn't mean a thing to me. But he says, if that will cause my brother to stumble, my love for my brother tells me I will never eat meat again. He's not going to let the exercise of his liberty destroy someone else. That's the choice of love. Thank you, Teddy, for bringing that up, because this is not just something that happens instinctively. This is something we must make a conscious decision to do. Anybody with thoughts or questions?
I like this last point, liberty, uncontrolled by love. I mean, I know that's what you just said, Paul said, but it's stated so plain. Liberty not controlled by love. I mean, how many times, do we look and we see things in our country? People say, I have the right to do this, or it's my God-given right to ABC. But there's no consideration for the people around you. I can say what I want to say, do what I want to do, but I don't care about anybody.
Exactly.
It's just reverence.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And law is not going to change that. We changed the Constitution, we changed the law, we've changed the Declaration of Independence. That's not going to change that. The only thing that's going to control that liberty is what comes from within me, the decision to love my brother. Thank you for that point. Anybody else with any thoughts or comments about what we've talked about this evening? All right, next week we'll get into chapter 9, and my spoiler alert is chapter 9 is going to continue the same thought. I will tell you, one of the commentators that I was reading actually argued that chapter 9 is a completely different letter, that Paul wrote at a different time and that somebody later combined it, because he thought the thoughts are so different in chapter 9 that it had to be a completely different letter. And he missed it entirely. It is very much the same idea. Paul's just going to be pursuing one particular point. He's going to pursue this idea of liberty that we have, but we don't necessarily exercise, because we see that we can benefit others if we don't exercise it. So anyway, read through chapter 9 then for next week.